The day my father signed the papers that were supposed to protect us, I wasn't invited. None of us were. It was just him, his new wife Linda, and a lawyer we'd never met before, in some downtown office with dark wood walls and too many framed certificates. Back then, it didn't feel like a big deal. He came home that night, loosened his tie, sat down at the kitchen table and said, "It's all taken care of now. When I'm gone, you kids won't have to fight over anything." He said it the way you talk about finally fixing the roof, just another chore crossed off the list. And I believed him. Of course I did. My father wasn't a rich man in the magazine sense. No boats, no vacations in Italy. He laid tile. He painted. He fixed things nobody else wanted to bother with. On weekends, he'd drag us along to look at beat-up houses with sagging porches and peeling paint. "See past the mess," he'd tell me. "Look at the bones." Slowly, over 30, 40 years, those bones turned into something solid. Our family home, a couple of rentals that brought in steady rent, and a piece of land just outside the city that everyone said would be worth a fortune one day. He didn't brag. He just had this quiet pride. "I'm not leaving you piles of cash," he'd say, wiping his hands on a paint-stained rag. "Cash disappears. I'm leaving you roofs, walls, rent checks. Something you can stand inside of when the world goes crazy." To me, that sounded better than a winning lottery ticket. By the time he hit his late 60s, he'd done it. The house was paid off. The rentals mostly ran themselves. The land kept getting calls from developers asking if he was ready to talk. He liked telling them no. So when he mentioned putting everything into a proper trust, I didn't panic. I just nodded. "Lawyer says it's the smart way to do it," he told me one Sunday. "Keeps things out of probate. Saves you kids a headache. Make sure you get what you're supposed to get." "Do you need me there?" I asked. He shook his head. No. It's just paperwork. You've got your own life. I'll handle it." Linda was at the sink, drying a plate. She smiled over his shoulder. "It's really boring stuff," she said. "Legal language, clauses, all that. We'll spare you." And the awful thing is, it sounded considerate. Linda hadn't always been in the picture. My mother died when I was in my early 30s. For a long time after, my father moved through the house like a man visiting a museum of his own life. Her robe stayed on the bathroom hook. Her shoes stayed by the door. Sometimes I think he kept them there so he wouldn't have to admit she was gone. Then one day, he mentioned a woman from church who made good coffee. A few months later, she was coming to dinner. A year after that, she was his wife.
She was polite, tidy, and very good at being helpful. She sorted his mail, lined up his pills in little plastic boxes, wrote down his appointments. I remember telling my brother, "At least she seems to actually care about him." We both agreed that was what mattered. I didn't realize she might care about something else just as much, the paperwork. The first time I heard the phrase revocable living trust was at that same kitchen table. He said it slowly, like he'd practiced it in the car. "Sounds fancy," I joked. He chuckled. "It's just a legal box. The lawyer put the house and the rentals in it. Makes things smooth later. You and your brother are in there, don't worry." I didn't ask for details. I didn't ask to see anything. I didn't write down the lawyer's name. I trusted my father. I trusted his word more than any stack of paper with seals and stamps. He had never lied to me about anything that mattered. Why would he start with the roof over our heads? In our family, there was no big fight, no slammed doors, no screaming, just small, quiet changes that later on turned out to matter. A calm sentence, a signed form, a missing question you should have asked and didn't. For us, it started with that one line, "It's all taken care of." I finished my coffee, rinsed my mug, and changed the subject. We talked about my job, the grandkids, what we'd do for Thanksgiving. Linda suggested hosting it at their place. She wanted to use the nice dishes, the ones my mother used to keep in the cabinet above the fridge for special occasions. My father liked that idea. He liked anything that made life feel normal again. Before I left, he walked me out to the driveway like he always did. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across the front yard. He stood there in his old jacket, hands in his pockets, looking up at the house. "You know," he said, "this place, this is what I'm proudest of, keeping a roof over all of you, keeping it from getting taken when times got tight. Don't ever let anybody tell you that doesn't matter." "I won't," I said. He nodded. "Good. Just remember, kiddo, this house, the rentals, the land, they're yours in the end. All of you kids. That's the whole point." I can still hear his voice when I replay that moment. At the time, I smiled, hugged him, and drove home without a second thought. I didn't know that somewhere in a file cabinet I'd never seen, there was another version of the story written in legal ink. On those pages, that promise in the driveway just wasn't there. We weren't really heirs at all, barely even mentioned. I see the small things now. Back then, they just looked like life moving on. After my father signed that first round of papers with Linda and the new lawyer, nothing in the house screamed, "Something is wrong." The recliner was still in its corner. The TV still hummed with the evening news. The pictures on the mantel stayed right where my mother had left them. What changed was who handled the quiet parts of his life. My father used to toss all the mail in a heap on the kitchen table, bills, coupons, tax notices, all leaning in one dangerous stack. After Linda moved in, the stack disappeared. "I'll take care of that," she'd say, sliding envelopes into a neat folder. "You don't need to worry about any of this, honey." Property tax bills, insurance renewals, bank statements, they all ended up in her hands first. She knew when a tenant was late on rent before I even knew the tenant's name. She knew his passwords because those websites confuse your dad. He didn't mind. "I spent my life outside," he told me once. "She's better with the paper stuff. Let her have it." So I did. Around the same time, his health started to fray at the edges. Not all at once. A little more shortness of breath, a story he tried to tell twice in one visit. A doctor's appointment he forgot until Linda reminded him. She went to every appointment with a notebook in her purse. She could list his medications off the top of her head. Nurses praised her for being organized, and they weren't wrong. She cooked heart-healthy meals, refilled his pill box, kept track of every lab result. But she also started answering questions that were meant for him. "Any chest pain lately, Mr. Carson?" the doctor would ask. "A little," she'd answer before he could speak. "Mostly in the evenings when he walks up from the basement. It's better since we changed his meds." My father would nod along like he was watching a documentary about himself. One afternoon, I caught his reflection in my rearview mirror as I drove him home. He looked smaller somehow, like his shoulders had given up fighting gravity. "You doing okay, Dad?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. Then he added, "Good thing I've got Linda. I'd be lost in all this paperwork without her." He said paperwork like other people say storm. A few weeks later at Sunday dinner, the conversation shifted. We'd finished the roast when Linda folded her hands on the table. "So," she said lightly, "we had another appointment with the lawyer this week." My brother and I both looked up. My father kept his eyes on his plate. "Just reviewing things," he said, "making sure everything's current." "The laws keep changing," Linda added. "The lawyer suggested we update some of the language in the trust. You kids are already taken care of. This is just logistics." She loved that word. "What does that mean exactly?" my brother asked. "Oh, nothing scary," she replied quickly. "Just clarifying who can sign what if your dad gets too sick, how the titles read, that kind of thing. It doesn't change who your father wants as his heirs. It just makes things smoother." "Do you need us there?" I asked. My father waved it off. "No need to drag you into that. It's just us signing a few updated pages. Everything's the same where it counts." The front doorbell rang. The dog started barking. Someone asked who wanted more coffee. The moment broke apart into small talk and clinking dishes. Nobody went back to the word logistics. After that, I started noticing other smaller shifts. A neighbor mentioned seeing Linda out front with a man in a suit pointing at the house. "Showing off your place?" the neighbor joked. "Showing off our portfolio," Linda corrected. "We've got a few properties now." Our portfolio. I told myself she just misspoke. My father had always said "we" about the houses too, even when he was the only one up on a ladder at midnight. Another day I saw a thick envelope from the county recorder's office on the hall table. By the time I hung up my coat, it was gone, tucked under Linda's arm. "Anything important?" I asked. "Just tax stuff," she called back. "Boring." I wanted to ask more. Instead, I let it go. When you're busy holding your own life together, it's easy to accept "don't worry, it's handled" as an answer. Then one evening, my father called me. "Your brother's mad," he said, skipping hello, "about the papers." "Are you cutting him out?" I asked, half joking, half not. Long silence. "No," he said. "It's just, if something happens to me first, Linda needs to be able to keep things simple. The lawyer says it's cleaner if certain things are in her name or in the trust with her in charge. But it all ends up with you kids anyway. That's the point." He was repeating someone else's explanation. I could hear it. "Did you read everything yourself?" I asked quietly, "or did he just talk you through it?" "He explained it," my father said. "I trust him. I'm tired, kiddo. I don't have the energy to sit there arguing over commas." I wanted to say, "This isn't about commas." Instead, I said, "Okay, Dad, as long as you're sure." "I'm sure," he answered. "It's taken care of. You kids will be fine." Later that week, Linda called me. "I know all of this can sound scary," she said. "Your dad gets confused when we go over the details. But I promise you, nothing we're doing changes who his heirs are. We're just trying to avoid a mess later. You know how ugly estates can get." "I do," I said, and I did. "The last thing I want is for you to feel shut out," she added. "But that's the thing about being shut out. It doesn't always happen with a slammed door. Sometimes it happens with signatures you never see, meetings you're not invited to, and one small word repeated over and over: logistics." By the time we sat in that conference room months later, listening to the will being read, those logistics had already done their work. The conference room smelled like coffee that had been sitting too long on a warmer. The blinds were half closed, letting in thin strips of winter light that landed across the polished table. There were 4 chairs on our side, 2 on the other. Somebody had lined up a box of tissues in the center, like they were expecting a performance. It was a few weeks after the funeral. I'd already done the things you're supposed to do, picked up his suit from the dry cleaner, closed out his cell phone plan, sat through a memorial service where people told the same stories about his work ethic and his bad jokes. I thought I was ready for this part. I wasn't. The lawyer, gray suit, neat beard, practiced expression, came in with a stack of folders under his arm and a legal pad in his hand. Linda followed behind him, dressed in black, the picture of a grieving widow. My brother and I sat across from them. I remember noticing the scratch on the table near my elbow and focusing on it like it mattered. "Thank you all for coming," the lawyer said, in that smooth tone people use when they've said the same sentence 100 times. "First, let me say again that I'm very sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man." He said it like he'd read it off a card. He opened the top folder, adjusted his glasses, and began. "This is the last will and testament of Daniel Carson, dated," he read out the date, "just a little over a year before my father died. Not decades old, not some dusty document from another life. Recent." He explained in simple words that this will was what they call a pour-over will. Everything my father owned that wasn't already in the trust would be poured into it when he died. "Your father's primary estate plan," he said, "is actually the revocable living trust we set up previously. That's where the real structure is. The will just catches anything left outside." He looked up briefly to see if we were following. Linda nodded. My brother and I glanced at each other. He kept reading. The will started with small bequests: a watch for my brother, my father's tools, all of my hand tools and power tools to me, in recognition of the many weekends she spent helping me on job sites. That stung and soothed at the same time. Then came a line about any remaining tangible personal property going to Linda. Furniture, clothes, all the physical leftovers of a life, fine. I could live with a stranger owning his recliner if I still believed the house around it belonged to his children. But then he turned the page and moved to the trust. "As set forth in the Carson Family Revocable Living Trust," he read, "all real property and financial accounts designated therein shall be distributed in accordance with the terms of that instrument." He slipped a thicker document out of the folder and flipped to a tab. The rustle of paper sounded very loud in that small room. "Here we are," he said, "Schedule A. This lists the assets held by the trust at the time it was last amended." He started to read them off. The primary residence, the Maple Street duplex, the little bungalow he'd fixed up on Oak Drive, the 10 acres outside town that everyone said would be worth something eventually, 2 savings accounts, an investment account I'd never heard of. Every building I'd watched my father bleed for, every property he'd talked about leaving for you kids, was right there, not in a general way, in black ink, line by line. I felt a strange, brief relief. There they are. They exist. He really did put them in a trust like he said. Then the lawyer moved to the section labeled Beneficiaries. "Upon my death," he read, "the trustee shall distribute as follows: 50% of the trust estate to Linda Carson outright, 25% to a subtrust for the benefit of Evan Carson, my brother, under Linda's management until he reached a certain age. The remaining 25% to Linda again as trustee, with broad discretion to use it for the health, support, maintenance, and best interests of any other descendants as she deems appropriate." He didn't say my name. He didn't say my children's names. Legally speaking, I had become any other descendants, tucked into a vague clause that depended entirely on Linda's sense of what was appropriate. My brother shifted in his chair. "That can't be right," he said quietly. The lawyer didn't look surprised. People rarely are in rooms like that. "I understand this can be difficult to hear," he said, "but this is the most recent version of your father's estate plan. He had the capacity to sign. He understood that he was consolidating control, particularly in the event of incapacity, to make things easier on Linda. He said it gently, but the words landed like stones. He told us, I managed, that the properties were for us, for you kids. That was the whole point. I'm sure he did, the lawyer replied, and I'm not saying he didn't still intend for both of you to benefit, but he chose this structure. He appointed Linda as trustee. She has the authority to manage, sell, reinvest, and make distributions. That was his decision. Linda dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue. Your father was very clear, she said, her voice shaky. He didn't want you burdened with decisions. He didn't want you fighting over houses or arguing about who gets what. He wanted it simple. He asked me to be the one to keep things together. That's all we did. I sat there, trying to match the man who had stood in the driveway telling me, "These roofs are yours in the end," with the signature on the papers in front of me. The lawyer flipped to another page. As for specific bequests to you, he said, looking at me now, your father did direct that you receive a one-time cash gift from an account that is not part of the trust. He named an amount. It was fine, respectable, enough to pay off my car, maybe set something aside for a rainy day. It was not a share of a lifetime of scraping and saving and painting and repairing. It was a consolation prize. My brother let out a bitter little laugh. So she gets the house, the rentals, the land, the accounts, and we get a watch, some tools, and a check? That's not fair, Linda protested softly. You'll benefit later. When I'm gone, Evan gets what's in his subtrust, and anything left in the main trust can go to all of you. Your father wanted me secure while I'm alive, that's all. While I'm alive. I thought of the age difference between them. I thought of how long while I'm alive could stretch. The lawyer steepled his fingers. I know this is a lot to process. My advice for today is to take these copies home, read through them when you're calmer, and talk to each other. If you have concerns about capacity or undue influence, that's a separate conversation, and it's not one you have to decide on right now. He slid manila envelopes across the table. They felt heavier than they should have. We left the building in a kind of fog. In the elevator, my brother stared straight ahead. I told him this would happen, he muttered. I told him putting everything in her hands was a mistake. He said we'd be fine, I replied. I heard how small it sounded. Outside, the air was sharp and cold. Cars moved past on the street like none of this mattered. Life goes on, even when yours has just been redrafted by someone else's pen. What are you going to do? My brother asked. I looked down at the envelope in my hand, at my father's name typed neatly on the tab. I don't know, I said. He's barely in the ground. I don't have the stomach to go to war with his widow over documents he signed. And that was the truth. I was angry, but grief took up most of the air back then. I didn't have much left for a fight. So we went home. We put the envelopes on our kitchen counters next to grocery lists and unpaid bills. We tried to tell ourselves there must be something we were missing, a clause we hadn't understood, a reason we just couldn't see yet. Back then, I didn't have a name for what we'd just lost. I only knew it felt like a wall had gone up between us and everything he'd worked for. A few months after the will reading, life looked almost normal again. Bills still came, the coffee still tasted the same, the house felt quieter but not dramatic. After that will reading, I told myself I needed time to grieve before I made any decisions. That sounded wise. It was also a very neat way to avoid opening the envelope the lawyer had handed me. I slid it into a kitchen drawer with old warranties and takeout menus and tried not to think about it. Life filled in the empty spaces. I still had prescriptions to refill, a car that needed oil changes, grandkids who wanted pancakes on Saturday mornings. Grief doesn't erase the electric bill. Linda called every so often with updates that sounded routine. We had to replace the water heater in the Maple Street place, she'd say. Trust paid for it. Your dad set it up so you wouldn't have to deal with that kind of headache. We adjusted the insurance coverage on the rentals. Premiums went up, but it's all handled. That was her favorite phrase. It's all handled. I almost started believing it. Not because I trusted her exactly, but because I was tired. Fighting over paperwork with a woman who'd spent the last few years managing my father's pills and appointments felt heavy. He had signed the documents. That was the part I couldn't get around. Holidays became careful, clipped things. Linda invited us the first Thanksgiving after he died. We went. It felt wrong not to. His chair at the head of the table sat empty, the same plate and silverware laid out like he might walk in late from a job. Nobody said it out loud, but I could feel everybody checking that chair without meaning to. Linda carved the turkey. She said grace. Her voice shook once, then settled. I'm grateful for this home, she said, for the years I had with your father in this house. She didn't say our house, not that day. That came later. Over time, the language shifted. My house is too quiet, she mentioned on the phone one afternoon. I've been thinking about painting my kitchen cabinets, she said another time. My house could use a little update. Each "mide" landed like a pebble in a jar. Small on its own, loud once the jar started filling up. I noticed. My brother noticed. Neither of us had the energy for a fight that would begin with, well, technically. Then, one Tuesday, my phone buzzed while I was digging around in my purse for my reading glasses. It was a message from our old next-door neighbor. Isn't this your dad's place? Underneath was a link. I tapped it. A real estate listing opened. For a moment, I thought she'd sent me the wrong house. The pictures looked staged. The walls were some fashionable gray instead of my mother's warm cream. The furniture all matched. No dent in the couch where my father used to sit. No clutter on the counter. No sign that a real family had ever lived there. Then I recognized the shape of the front window, the slope of the stairs, the way the hallway narrowed just before the bedrooms. It was his house, our house. Stripped and polished for strangers. 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in established neighborhood, the description read, lovingly maintained. First time on the market. First time on the market. I heard my father's voice in my head. This house isn't going anywhere. It's for my kids. I scrolled past the pretty photos to the dry part at the bottom where the numbers live. Lot size, year built, property taxes, and then a line most people probably never notice. Owner, Maple Ridge Property Group, LLC. Not estate of Daniel Carson. Not Linda Carson, trustee. Some company I'd never heard of. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with age. I called my brother. Check your texts, I said. I sent you something. A beat of silence, then an exhale that sounded more like a growl. You've got to be kidding me. They're selling it? Looks that way. He paused. Who the hell is Maple Ridge Property Group? Looks like they bought up our childhood, I said. He swore under his breath. I knew she'd cash out as soon as she could. I told him this was what would happen when he put everything in her hands. We could have bought it, I said softly. If it was too much for her, if she needed money, we could have tried. That would require her seeing us as anything but an afterthought, he snapped. He wasn't wrong. That night I called Linda. "Oh, you saw the listing," she said, almost cheerful. "I was going to call you this week." "You're selling the house," I said. I kept my voice level. "It's too big for me," she replied. "Your father is gone. I don't need that much space, and the market is strong. It's the sensible thing." "You told us the trust was there to keep things steady," I said. "You told us nothing would really change." "And it hasn't," she answered. "The house is in the trust. I'm just converting it into cash. It's still an asset in the same pot. When I'm gone, whatever's left will be distributed the way your father set it up. You'll benefit eventually." Eventually. I let the words sit between us. "What about this Maple Ridge company?" I asked. "The listing says they own it." "It's just an LLC," she said. "The lawyers suggested putting the properties into a company. Liability, taxes, all that. It's still the trust behind it. It's just cleaner on paper." Cleaner on paper. My father had used different words standing in that driveway years earlier, but the meaning had been clear. These roofs are yours in the end. On paper, standing in that conference room months after he died, the meaning had been very different. And now, on a website for anyone with a pre-approval letter to see, there was an asking price where his promise used to be. After I hung up, I went back to the listing and stared again at that owner line. I could almost hear him. "If something doesn't make sense, look at the paperwork." I had spent 2 years avoiding those folders and envelopes, telling myself it was too late, too complicated, too ungrateful to question what a sick man had signed. But seeing strangers scheduled to walk through my father's living room on Saturday between 2 and 4, that did something to me. I wasn't a lawyer, and I wasn't any kind of investigator. I was just a tired woman with a drawer full of papers I'd been pretending not to see. So I did something very simple. I stood up, went to that kitchen drawer, pushed aside the rubber bands and old takeout menus, and pulled out the envelope with the lawyer's name on it. If they were going to sell my father's house under a name I'd never heard, I was finally ready to find out exactly how his signature got them there. I didn't start with the will this time. I already knew how that felt. I started with the trust. I put the packet on the kitchen table, made a small cup of coffee, and turned off the noise. No TV, no radio. Just the pages I'd been avoiding. "Carson Family Revocable Living Trust," the cover said. My father's name, Linda's, the lawyer's. I'm not a lawyer, so I didn't chase every term. I read slowly and underlined what I could put into plain English. My father created it. He was trustee while he was healthy. If he couldn't serve, Linda took over. After he died, she stayed in charge. She could manage, sell, reinvest. She had discretion to support descendants as she thought best. I'd already seen what that meant. What I wanted to know now was simpler. How did my father's house end up under the name Maple Ridge Property Group instead of his? The company wasn't in the main text, but at the back there was Schedule A, Assets of the Trust. Our house, the residence, the land, 2 accounts. In small print, amended and restated 1 year before his death. Updated again a few months later. A handwritten note, title transfers in progress. My father used to say, if something doesn't make sense, follow the paper. So I opened my laptop and went to the county's public records search. Type in an address, hit enter, and the history of a property shows up. I started with the house I grew up in. The early records were what you'd expect. The old deed when my parents bought it, a refinance, a lien release. Then 2 newer entries. The first was a deed from my parents to the trust. Grantor, Daniel and Margaret Carson. Grantee, Carson Family Revocable Living Trust. Date, before his health collapsed. The signature looked like him, heavy pen, that little hook on the D in Daniel. The second deed made my stomach tighten. Grantor, Carson Family Revocable Living Trust. Grantee, Maple Ridge Property Group, LLC. Signature block, Daniel Carson, trustee. The date was from a week he'd spent in the hospital. The handwriting was close to his, but smoother, neater, like somebody copying his name. Could he have signed something from a hospital bed? Maybe, but no one had mentioned a notary visit. No one had said, "We moved the house out of the trust while he was hooked up to machines." I checked the Maple Street rental. Same pattern. One deed into the trust when he was still walking on his own, another out to Maple Ridge during his rehab stay. Oak Drive, same story. The land outside town, again. Different dates, same rhythm. Into the trust when he was strong, out to Maple Ridge when he was weak. I printed the deeds and spread them across the table. On the left, the old documents. My parents' names, side by side. My father's uneven signature from the years when he was climbing ladders and arguing with inspectors. On the right, the newer transfers. Trust to Maple Ridge, all signed when he was sick. All with that strangely tidy version of his name. I'd been upset before, but seeing it laid out in black and white hit me in a different way. I picked up one of the Maple Ridge deeds and held it next to a 20-year-old loan paper with his signature. To a stranger, they might look close enough. To me, they didn't match. What I had now wasn't just a bad feeling about a house being sold. I had dates, documents, and one question that wouldn't let go. Whose hand was actually on those lines? I thought about calling an estate attorney right then, but it felt like skipping a step. Before lawyers and arguments, I needed to know whether the ink itself told the truth. So I sat back down at the computer, opened a new search box, and typed 3 words I never expected to type. Forensic Document Examiner. If my father's name had been used to move his work away from his own children, I wanted someone whose whole job was telling the difference between almost him and actually him. I always thought forensic document examiner was something you only heard on crime shows. Turns out they have websites just like plumbers and dentists. I called 3 before I found one who picked up his own phone. His name was Harris. His office was in an old brick building near the courthouse, the kind of place that had probably been a bank when my parents were young. "I'm not sure I have a case," I told him on the phone. "I just have a bad feeling and a stack of deeds." He said, "Bad feelings are how most of my files start. Bring what you have. I'll tell you if it's worth your money." So I did. I showed up with a worn grocery bag full of photocopies and originals, old loan documents, my father's driver's license, birthday cards he'd signed, the trust papers, and those Maple Ridge deeds I couldn't stop staring at. Harris laid everything out on a long table under bright lamps. He was in his 60s too, with reading glasses that slid down his nose when he concentrated. "Here's what I'm going to look for," he said. "Rhythm, pressure, habits. People are creatures of habit, especially in their signatures. When something big changes, age, illness, injury, you'll see a drift. But a drift is different from a disguise." He pulled out a magnifier and one of those little angled lights. We started with the oldest documents, my parents' purchase of the house, a refinance, an old loan application. My father's name marched across them in the same heavy, deliberate way. The D in Daniel always had that loop. The C in Carson always sagged a little. "See that hitch in the middle?" Harris said, tracing it with a pen cap. "That's his hand pausing. He does it every time. That's a habit." Then he put one of the Maple Ridge deeds next to an old document. "Now look here," he said. The signature on the new deed was tidier, not wildly different. If you weren't looking, you might think it was just a good day for his handwriting. But the little hitch was gone. The pressure looked lighter. The line moved in one smooth sweep, like someone drawing from memory instead of muscle. "Could he just have been having a good day?" I asked. "Anything's possible," he said. "But the question isn't, can I imagine a reason? It's, what's most consistent with a lifetime of habit?" He went through each Maple Ridge deed, each hospital period document, comparing them to older samples. He didn't rush. Every now and then he'd grunt softly, the way my father used to when something confirmed what he already suspected. After an hour or so, he sat back. "I can't give you answers off the top of my head," he said. "I'll need to scan these, measure, document everything properly. If this goes to court, the details matter. But I can tell you this much. There are significant indications that some of these later signatures were not written by the same hand as the earlier ones." "Significant indications," I repeated. "That's my polite way of saying I'm concerned," he said. "But I don't stamp probable forgery on anything until I've done the full workup." He quoted a fee. It wasn't small. It also wasn't bigger than the knot in my chest. "Do it," I said, "please." He nodded. "I'll have a written report in a couple of weeks." If you end up talking to a lawyer, tell them to call me. I know how to speak their language. 2 weeks later, his envelope arrived. I sat at the same kitchen table, opened it with the same shaky hands I'd had the day I opened the trust. The report was careful, measured, full of phrases like highly probable and cannot be reconciled with natural variation. But buried in the polite language was a simple conclusion. It was more likely than not that several of the signatures on the Maple Ridge deeds had not been written by my father. Not might not maybe, more likely than not. I made one more call I'd been avoiding. This time it wasn't to Linda or the original lawyer who'd drafted the trust. I found a different attorney, one who specialized in contested estates and property disputes. A friend from church had used him when her brother tried something similar with their mother's house. He met me in a small office with too many file boxes stacked against the wall. "Tell me the story," he said. So I did. I told him about my father's promises in the driveway, about the will reading, about Maple Ridge, about the hospital dates on the deeds. I slid Harris's report across the desk. He read it slowly, then leaned back. "This isn't just hurt feelings over who got what," he said. "If a court believes those signatures aren't his, we're not talking about family drama. We're talking about fraud. Undue influence at best, outright forgery at worst." My stomach fluttered. Hearing someone else say it out loud made it heavier and clearer. "Can anything be done now?" I asked. "Or is it too late?" He shook his head. "You're within the time limits. We can file to challenge the transfers, maybe the trust amendments, depending on what else we find. It will be hard, it will be ugly, and it will not be cheap. I won't pretend otherwise." I thought about the listing, the empty chair at Thanksgiving, the word eventually hanging over us like a ceiling. "I'm not doing this to grab money," I said. "I'm doing it because my father worked his whole life for those houses, and I don't think he meant for them to end up in a shell company with somebody else's signature on the deed." "That's the right reason," he said quietly. "If you want to move forward, we'll start with one thing, getting everything on paper. Every document, every date, every hospital record, every email we can subpoena from that first lawyer's office. He slid a retainer agreement across the desk. I stared at the line where my name was supposed to go and thought, somewhere, my father must have believed paper could protect us. All right, I said, picking up the pen. Let's see what the paperwork really says. Court doesn't feel like justice at first. It feels like waiting. Waiting in hard chairs. Waiting while your lawyer whispers with someone in a suit across the aisle. Waiting for a judge who has seen 100 families like yours tear themselves apart over houses and bank accounts. But we filed anyway. My attorney explained it in plain English. We were asking the court to look at the trust, the deeds to Maple Ridge, and the way those signatures appeared while my father was sick. We wanted the judge to decide whether those transfers were valid and whether the trust itself had been twisted away from what my father intended. I'm not promising you a movie ending, he warned. What I can promise is that we'll get the full story on the record. Most of the real work happened long before we ever saw a courtroom. There were subpoenas to the first lawyer's office, to the title company, to the banks that wired money after the sales, even to the hospital where my father spent those last months. We got copies of emails I was never meant to read. I saw Linda writing to the original lawyer. Can we make sure I stay in control if he declines? Is there a way to move the property so the kids can't force a sale later? I saw replies about streamlining and consolidating authority and minimizing interference. They never used the word erase. They didn't have to. Then, buried in a production of old files from a different law office, one I'd never heard of, my attorney found something nobody expected. It's an addendum, he said, sliding a thin document across his desk toward me. Your father signed this about 3 years before the other trust was updated. The paper was only a few pages long. It used the same formal language, but the idea was simple enough that even my tired brain could follow it. If any beneficiary or trustee pressured him while he was sick, tampered with documents, tried to move property out of the trust for their own benefit in a way that conflicted with prior plans, then any transfer tied to that conduct could be undone. The person responsible could be treated as if they'd died before him, cut out. Their share would pass directly to my children in equal parts, by name, my brother's. At the bottom, in that familiar heavy ink, was my father's signature. The little hitch in the middle, the sagging C. No smooth copycat lines, just him. Why didn't we see this before? I asked. Because it wasn't drafted by the lawyer Linda used, my attorney said. Your father went to someone else earlier. They prepared this addendum to his original trust. Later, when Linda's lawyer restated everything, they either didn't know this existed or they chose to pretend it didn't. He tapped the paper. This, he said, is your father saying, if anyone tries to use my illness or ignorance of the law to steal from my kids, there will be consequences. He smiled very faintly. If you ask me, this is your silent heirs clause. I sat there with my fingers on the edge of the page, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. My father's presence, not as a victim, but as someone who'd looked ahead further than we knew. The day we went to court, Linda was there with her attorney. Maple Ridge had their own lawyer, too. It felt strange seeing people whose business card names matched the documents that had moved my childhood home into someone else's portfolio. The judge was an older woman with tired eyes and a sharp voice. She listened as my lawyer laid out the timeline, the healthy years, the original trust, the quiet addendum, the later restatement, the hospital stays, the Maple Ridge deeds. Harris, the handwriting man, testified. He spoke carefully, explaining natural variation versus disguised writing, how illness changes a signature but doesn't erase lifelong habits. He never used the word forgery outright, but the meaning was clear enough. Then my attorney handed the judge the addendum. "Your Honor," he said, "this is not my client trying to rewrite her father's wishes. This is her father, in his own hand, saying what should happen if anyone else tried to." Linda's lawyer argued, of course. He said the addendum was old, superseded, incompatible with the newer trust. He said my father wanted Linda protected above all. He said selling the properties into an LLC was sound management. The judge sat quietly through all of it. When she finally spoke, the room went very still. "I see a man who tried twice to plan his estate," she said, tapping the addendum with her pen. "Once with this document where he clearly anticipated the possibility of undue influence, and again later when he was more vulnerable, surrounded by people with something to gain." She looked over her glasses at Linda. "Whatever else is true here, I'm not prepared to ignore his earlier, clearer intent, especially in light of the handwriting evidence and the timing of these transfers." She didn't solve everything in one speech. That's not how real courts work. But she did do 3 things that mattered. She froze the sale proceeds from my father's house and the other properties. No one could move that money without court approval. She ordered the Maple Ridge deeds set aside temporarily while the case continued. And she recognized the addendum as valid, at least enough to keep Linda from acting as if she was the only one who mattered. Walking out of that courthouse, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steadier. For the first time since we sat in that conference room listening to the will, it felt like my father's real voice had made it into the record. Walking out of that courthouse, I still didn't feel like I'd won anything. I just felt for once that my father's side of the story was finally on record. When the judge finally issued her full ruling, it didn't come with fanfare. It came in a thick envelope. My lawyer called first. "I'd like you to come in and read it here," he said. "We'll go through it together." So I sat at his conference table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching him flip through the pages. "Here's the part that really matters to you," he said, and turned the document so it faced me. The language was formal, but the meaning was simple enough when he translated. The court accepted Harris's handwriting report. It accepted the hospital record showing my father's condition on the days those Maple Ridge deeds were supposedly signed. It accepted the addendum, the silent heirs clause, as a valid part of my father's estate plan. Based on that, my lawyer said, tapping the page, the judge is voiding the transfers of the house and the other properties to Maple Ridge. She's treating those deeds as if they never legally happened. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "What about the trust?" I asked. He nodded. "The court found that the way the later trust was restated when your father was sick and dependent conflicted with his earlier, clearer intent. She's not throwing the whole thing out, but she is removing Linda as trustee and reinstating the original structure as modified by that addendum." He pointed to a paragraph. "Linda is treated as if she predeceased your father for purposes of distribution. Her interest is cut off. The assets that were in question, the house, the rentals, the land, are to be distributed in equal shares to you and your brother." I stared at the words equal shares until they blurred. "And Maple Ridge?" I asked. "Maple Ridge," he said, "goes back to being just a paper shell with nothing in it as far as your father's property is concerned." The judge also referred the file to the district attorney and the state bar. "That's not your problem now." There was a small, mean part of me that wanted someone to go to jail. Another part just felt tired. "Does this mean we get the house back?" I asked, finally saying the thing that mattered most to the kid in me. He smiled. "The proceeds from the sale of the house and the other properties have been sitting frozen in that account because of the judge's temporary order. Now, with this ruling, that money will be treated as if it was your father's property all along. Half to you, half to your brother. You can use your share to buy something or not. That's your choice." It wasn't the same as walking back into my childhood home and finding my father in his chair. It wasn't a magic reversal of time, but it was something solid. Later, my brother and I sat at my kitchen table, the ruling between us. "So that's it," he said. "She's just out?" "Legally, yes," I said. "Emotionally, that's more complicated." He nodded. "You going to call her?" "I don't think there's anything left to say that a judge hasn't already said better," I answered. We were quiet for a while. "You know," he added eventually, "if Dad hadn't gone to that first lawyer and made that addendum, we'd probably be out of luck." "I've been thinking the same thing," I said. He didn't trust his own body at the end, but he still trusted paper. We both laughed a little at that. In the months that followed, there were accountants to talk to, tax forms to file, decisions to make. None of it was glamorous. Splitting up assets isn't some grand cinematic moment. It's meetings and signatures and numbers on a screen. I used part of my share to pay off my mortgage. For the first time in my life, my house, small, nothing fancy, was truly mine. No bank, no landlord, just a deed with my name on it and nobody else's. The rest, I didn't rush. I put it aside in a place where it could grow quietly, not as found money, not as a prize, but as proof that my father's 30-odd years climbing ladders and scraping paint hadn't been swallowed by someone else's paperwork. Sometimes I drove past the old neighborhood and slowed down at the corner. The house looked different now, new paint, new landscaping, someone else's children's bikes in the yard. It hurt, but in a dull, distant way. The people inside had paid a fair price to an entity they had no idea was built on forged signatures. That wasn't their fault. They had their own stories, their own fights, their own losses. I didn't want revenge on them. I didn't really want revenge on Linda anymore either. The court had already done what I couldn't have done on my own, drawn a line. What I wanted more than anything was for my father's work to mean what he'd said it meant. Not wealth, not status, just stability. A roof, a little breathing room for his kids and grandkids. One evening, my oldest granddaughter asked why I kept a framed copy of that one page of the judge's ruling on a shelf in the hallway. "Because," I told her, "your great-grandfather spent his whole life building something he couldn't carry with him. And when someone tried to rewrite who it was for, we didn't scream, we didn't break windows. We went and found the right piece of paper." She frowned. "That's kind of boring," she said. I smiled. She wrinkled her nose. "That sounds boring," she said. I laughed. "Maybe it is," I told her, "but it's the kind of boring that kept a roof over our heads." If there's anything I wish people would take from all of this, it's not sue your relatives or trust no one. It's simpler than that. Listen carefully when people start talking about logistics and cleaner on paper. Write down the names of the lawyers. Ask for copies while everyone is still healthy enough to be annoyed with you. And if, God forbid, you ever find yourself reading a will that makes you feel like you've been erased, remember this. If there's anything I learned, it's this. I spent a long time being quiet, thinking there was nothing I could do. In the end, all I really did was pick up a folder, open it, and keep asking questions until someone had to answer.